Okay, let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I see that we have 20 people. I'm sure there are some others that will be joining soon. My name is Pablo Medina. I'm a principal at 10 Count Consulting. And together with Mark and Jonathan, we are very excited to have you guys today for this webinar around getting ready with DSCSA compliance. A few quick 2 seconds comment on the background why we made the decision to put this webinar together. Certainly, if you are in the DSCSA area, you are seeing the increase of the activity that all of us are seeing over the last few months, certainly with the exceptions, but particularly we are hearing from clients and stakeholders across the supply chain, the increasing number of inspections that are coming from both the FDA and the state regulators. And we thought it would be a really good opportunity to talk a little bit about what to expect in an inspection and a bit more of what we are hearing, what we are seeing, to help you get prepared for the likely event if you are a relatively large manufacturer, for example, or wholesaler, and even I would say dispensers, of being audited for either the FDA or a state regulator. Before we get started, some house cleaning comments. The first one is there will be Q&A time dedicated at the end of the presentation. So if you can add your comments into the chat, we will certainly take note of that and we'll add into the questions at the end. And then Mark, if we can go to the next one, please. The usual disclaimer, obviously this is a webinar that is intended for educational and informational purposes only. You are encouraged to consult with your qualified legal advisors if you have any particular questions around DSCSA requirements. And obviously this is a voluntary webinar. We are not mandating anyone to participate on this instance. With that, I will pass on Mark and Jonathan perhaps to briefly introduce each other, and then we can jump directly into the content.
Thanks, Pablo. Jonathan, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Jonathan Keller, partner in the healthcare group at Favorite Drinker, based in New Jersey, and I partnered with Mark and 10 Count on a number of DSCSA, drug supply chain, matters, and look forward to talking with the team here.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Pablo, for getting us started. So yeah, Mark Harhoff, founder of 10 Count Consulting, also a principal, and glad to have you guys join today. I guess one note is we are using the Q&A feature, so you should see a Q&A button if you have any questions that come up as we go. And as Pablo mentioned, we'll hit those at the end. I think chat is disabled on this one, if I remember right. In terms of agenda, we'll talk about some of the things that are happening out in the industry. Like Pablo said, Jonathan will walk us through kind of what happens when companies get 483s, just to kind of understand what that looks like. And then we'll talk about some of the proactive steps that we are helping and seeing clients take, and some things that you can do kind of short term to be thinking about. So I guess we'll jump right in. We've spent some time, and we spend a lot of time, I guess, in monitoring both federal and state things that are happening on DSCSA, especially 483 and warning letters, but also at the state level anytime that there's enforcement's done. We have, as was mentioned, seen an uptick in DSCSA activity, especially this year, which we'll kind of walk through in a minute. We've gathered some information from 483s that have DSCSA referenced in them to kind of show you some of the trends that we're seeing in 483s. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. But I guess the first message, because I think there is some confusion when you go to different industry groups or you hear different firms, consulting firms or others talk about it. DSCSA is actually fully in effect right now. The caveat is that there may be exemptions that you're able to utilize, one of them being the traded partner connection exemption. So if you're attempting to make connections to trading partners, you have until May 27th of this year for manufacturers, August 27th for distributors, and then November 27th for large dispensers, and then next year, November for small dispensers. Outside of that, it is important to remember that there are already aspects of DSCSA that are in effect. So, and we're seeing this in the inspections and in the 483s and others. I put up on the slide here, this was kind of a good summary slide that was done at HDA DMC this year on a panel that was around the state of implementation. So these are kind of the highlights around what are some of the key things that industry is already required to be doing. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go through these. In terms of what we're seeing from 483s, so first off, we have seen an uptick, as you can see on the left-hand side. In 2019 and 2021, we saw just a handful of DSCSA things happen. And then prior to that, there were one or two that have happened in past years. We've also seen some things around compounding that was kind of a unique situation that we excluded in here that because we felt like it wasn't quite as applicable to DSCSA. It was just using a DSCSA clause or two for some other activity that was going on. But in general, we've seen an uptick. So last year we saw 643s. This year we've already seen a couple, and basically if you trend it out, basically it starts to look like more like 20 by the end of the year, or up to as many as 24. So the important thing is there that is we're seeing an uptick happen even in the first part of this year. We're hearing from entities that have been inspected that are talking about it, trade shows or others, that is in fact happening, that more manufacturers and even some distributors have shared of inspections happening. Sometimes it can be around an incident that's happening, stolen product, other things. But more often now it's just for DSCSA or just a general inspection with DSCSA in it. You can see the trends right now. We've seen about in 483 notices, we've seen about 60% for manufacturers, about 20% distributors, some contract manufacturers, and then others, which were kind of specialty pharmacy and compounding situations. The important thing to start thinking about is, and really what we wanted to kind of highlight today is starting to think about what does this mean to your organization. So how do you understand what the FDA is looking for? Because this is not only just like what's in the law, it's also how is your company complying and operating and doing procedures and training to show that they have coverage for those requirements. So the areas that we've seen in summary, the biggest one by far has been things around notifications. So if you receive, for example, a 3911, which is a document that the FDA created for suspect and illegitimate product notifications, if you receive one from a trading partner, or you receive a notification from FDA, from state, you're required to take certain actions depending on what's happening in certain situations. Or if you have one yourself, you're required to notify others in certain situations. So that by far has been the number one thing that's getting cited, is that organizations don't have clear policies documented and trained for employees to handle those situations. Slightly different note, but related, is identification and investigation of suspect product. So making sure that you have process and procedures that say, what do I do if any of my employees, and really the way we typically look at it is anybody that could be handling or touching product or in the sight of product, that they're aware of what to do if they see something, and how that should sort of move on to investigations or quarantining, depending on what happens. Record retention. So you're required, according to DSCSA, to keep certain records. Generally, it's been about 6 years from the last date of an incident or action. So you also want to build that into your policies to say what you're storing for that. And then other things like disposition of illegitimate products. So what do you do whenever you have illegitimate product? Do you have processes showing what you're doing with it? Product verification. So this is a new thing for DSCSA, is that you need to have processes in order to both generate verification requests if you have incidents where you need to do that for suspect product or other situations, and also responding to those verifications. So if I'm a manufacturer or repackager, I have to be able to accept verification requests and respond to them. And there's different methods and means to do that, but generally the industry has been moving towards VRS, the verification router system, as a way that's being addressed. Some are still using email as well, and we've heard some regulators say that they are also understanding of that. And then just some other miscellaneous things that we're seeing. So in general, we are seeing, this uptick in DSCSA being cited. I think the other thing to mention on the right-hand side is there are different references in the law and guidances for those different situations. So typically, in this case, the FDA will cite those to say what aspect of the law they feel like is not being complied to. So these are just kind of some of the general trends that we're seeing out in the industry. And then just to give you an example, and these slides will be available afterwards for anybody that wants in a recording of this session, but this is just to give you an example of what the actual verbiage can look like. So this was from a 483, a public 483, but it shows you, specifically what happened and what are they saying is not sufficient. And then they describe kind of what they saw and what they expect to see. And this usually is kind of how the 483 will start, is with these observations. And Jonathan will talk about that, how that's handled in a minute. And yeah, I guess with that, I'll pass it over to you, Jonathan, if you want to kind of step through like what happens if you have a client that receives a 483, what's that like?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mark. Well, it's not a fun experience, but let's go to the next slide. Great. So first, just want to give a brief background about what is 483, the importance of preparation, because knowing that will be key in understanding how to properly respond. So first, what is 483? It's an observation report that is given to the management team after an FDA inspection. And it is the inspector's observations as to what they believe would constitute a violation of the Federal Food Drug Cosmetic Act or related acts. The full report is provided to the management team at the end of the inspection. It's called at the closeout meeting, where there'll be a discussion about what was found, any questions. Sometimes there is a daily wrap-up call at the end of the day, because the intent is at the closeout meeting, there really shouldn't be any surprises of the management team. They should have a good understanding during the inspection what the observations were being found, pointed out to by the inspector. Typically, the inspections can last anywhere, we see 5 to 7 days, I say on average, but it can be less, can be more. It really is just going to be very facility specific, fact specific. What's the reason for the inspection? So what happens next? What's the implications of the 483? So after you receive the 483, the agency takes that on their end. They will start to prepare a report. If you've seen the letters EIR, Establishment Inspection Report. That is the FDA full report, which describes the observations, the documents collected, the materials, etc. Because once the 483 is issued to the management team, the company responds, and the EIR is written up, and the facility will be given one of 3 classifications of the inspection. If no 483 is issued, that's the simple one, no action indicated. Because no 483 was issued, no action indicated, nothing is required. But if a 483 is issued, it's going to result in one of 2. The lesser one, voluntary action indicated, that just means violations were identified, but they were not so severe to warrant an immediate regulatory action by the FDA. The more severe one is called OAI, official action indicated. That's when a serious violation or violations were identified, and it will require FDA enforcement. Most often, that would be a warning letter. And at the bottom here, I put a link to FDA's Investigations Operations Manual, IOM. Why is that important? So this is a full operations manual that the FDA inspectors will use during the inspection. And specifically, there's a chapter 5, on inspections. I would strongly encourage individuals who are part of the inspection team, the response team, or who will be the point person for the FDA during the inspection to read and understand this chapter. Why? It will really provide a good roadmap as to how the FDA will conduct the inspection, what they will, and their processes. So it just will help you better navigate the 43 inspection, especially if you haven't been through a few. Next slide, please. Okay, so you received the 43. What do you do next? So it is important to treat it with the utmost seriousness. As I mentioned earlier, you first really want to understand the observations so you can begin to address them. Because what you have to do within 15 days, develop a response. It's called a CAPA plan, corrective and preventative action plan. You develop a robust CAPA, and this is really key because it's where the internal and external resources that you will use can bring some significant expertise. So in the CAPA, you'll want to address not only each individual observation and how it was corrected, but a litany of other items. So this would mean the timeline. You'll do an investigation as to what is the root cause for the observation. So that addresses the what, the why, the how. You'll analyze and look at, was this a one-time observation, or is it more of a systemic issue that needs to be remediated? It could include a risk analysis of the specific product, meaning, is the product defective, adulterated? Does a product need to be quarantined or segregated? So all of these issues need to be analyzed, thought about, and kind of written up in the response. What's also key is submitting and attaching to the CAPA plan document evidence supporting the corrective actions that are being implemented and taken. And so this can mean revising the SOPs, updated protocols, or other documents supporting that the corrective action is underway. Because we see that many warning letters are a result of either the failure to support objectionable evidence that the issue was remediated, or just the other documentation addressing the underlying concern. And I'll add, the initial response is due within 15 business days, but I think the agency understands, I think we all know, there's very unlikely you're going to address all the observations within those 15 days. So what we see is you provide the initial response, and then on a regular schedule, every 4 weeks, 6 weeks, it's going to depend on the observations and how you're responding, but you want to provide a continuous update to the agency to let them know that these are the open items, here's the timeline, here's how we're closing out, and importantly, we're meeting the action items on the timeline and closing it out along with all the supporting documentation. And at the bottom here, just listed the general flow as to who's going to review, possibly touch the 43 in your submission. So obviously the on-site inspector prepares the report. It's then reviewed by the investigative supervisor, and then makes its way over to the compliance officer in OAR. Sometimes it'll go to CEDAR, and within CEDAR, there could be other divisions where if they need to bring in a subject matter expert to analyze or evaluate an issue, those folks will be involved as well. So I say that because it's important to have a clear and succinct CAPA plan put in place and report that you are supplying to the FDA, because individuals reviewing it will not be the ones who are on site, who will not be as familiar with your facility and policies and procedures. Next slide, please. So just give a quick recap. Preparation really is key. So one, you need to really fully understand the inspection process. And that can either be from going through several 43s, but the OIM chapter on inspections is really a good roadmap for what to expect. As Mark mentioned before, one of the common observations was employees not being properly trained, specifically with how to respond to suspect product. So employee training really is key, because you want to know who's going to take the lead, who's going to be the point person, how employees are to respond. And with the clients I've worked with, we typically will set up, they call it a war room or conference room, which that really is the command center where everyone will congregate, where that would be the room where matters regarding the inspection can be coordinated and can be discussed, and that's where all the documentation can come from. Another important part of the prep is if you've had prior 43s, EIRs, that you want to make sure that those have been remediated, those observations have been remediated, but also that they don't reoccur, because during a follow-up inspection, chances are they will look at those issues as well to make sure that they have been corrected and remain corrected. And then another great way to prepare, it can be mock inspections, doing a gap analysis, and this can be internally or also working with external consultants to not only evaluate the 43 observations, but to go beyond to see were there other areas that could be deficient, where there could be gaps, but just were not observed during the week that the FDA inspector was there. And just to add, I'm sure everyone knows, but even a moderately bad 43 can be very expensive to remediate, not only from the dollar perspective, but just from the hours and the manpower and that it takes. Also, if product needs to be quarantined or held, again, that's another cost that will just need to be evaluated. And then I'll just add, if you do get a warning letter, so the OAI, the official action indicated, so that means that the FDA has considered or identified that the facility is out of compliance with its CGMP standards, Food Drug Cosmetic Act. That does bring reputational harm and may impact if you have pending applications or government procurement process open. So they want to avoid a warning letter, I say, at all costs. So that really is why responding to the 43 with taking serious, robust, pulling in the right experts really is key. Mark, I'll turn it back to you.
Oh, that's great, Jonathan. Yeah, thanks for those insights. Yeah, just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to use the Q&A button. We did have one question come in, was around what's the state's activity been on DSCSA? And I guess even though we didn't include those kind of things at the state level, because for several different reasons. One, we have not seen a huge push in DSCSA yet, but it's starting to happen. Some states have started sending out questionnaires and started utilizing product verification, both with a tool NABP has and other means. So we are starting to see, I guess, a growing interaction from the state level. And I expect by the end of this month, you'll see even more of an uptick in that. I think the regulators are now starting to understand better what DSCSA is and how it's useful. So, and then just kind of building on what Jonathan said in terms of prevention. So, we definitely find, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure in this case. So, what can you do to basically make sure that you do everything in advance to try to prevent 43s from happening? Probably when we take a step back from DSCSA and we, help clients start to understand it, especially leadership at clients, which they may not be as in the weeds. we typically point to two main things kind of being the core of where your DSCSA sort of journey will start. One is knowing your role. So what DSCSA role are you performing? So, manufacturer, distributor, dispenser, 3PL. And it's important to note that, and many companies and any company can serve multiple roles. It's more about what you're doing with the product. Am I packaging it? Am I selling it to someone else? Am I dispensing it? Or am I performing a service for someone else? So that's definitely a key thing. This really gets tricky, as it kind of notes there, when you get into certain situations. Specifics are important. Scenarios are important. There are some areas that the industry is really still trying to iron out, and I would say there's not really full alignment on. 340B, borrow and loan, contracted pharmacies, those are areas where there's still, I think, alignment happening, and even standards still being discussed and determined. So the challenge is with the date, fast approaching, it really is going to depend on entities to have a position. So you really want to at least make sure you have a position on what you think is required and how you're covering it, and just be able to stand behind that. And obviously, it's a dynamic situation. So as the industry starts to normalize things more, it's something that we call effectiveness checks. So we recommend clients doing that once a quarter, at least a couple times a year at a minimum, where you're looking at what's changed, what new guidances have come out, what new standards, what's the industry doing. The second part, besides knowing your role, is looking at where ownership changes occur. So this is a title change law, I think is the way I've heard it described. It's not really a pedigree law. So it doesn't necessarily require you to know every single position or location that a product's been in terms of reporting that. It's more about being able to show who you bought it from, who you sold it to, so that when there's situations and incidents that happen, that you're able to respond quickly with the needed information. So the important note there is there are, in both those cases really, but more in the ownership change one, there are not only transactions, but also products that are exempt. And there's different forms of that. So there's exclusions. So there's things that are called out specifically in the law that are not required. And then there's, there can be waivers where you request for something to be waived by the FDA. And then there can be exemptions where things or transactions are noted as exempt. And those are usually done more broadly. So like, for example, the connected trading partner exemption was one exemption. And the important footnote on that is to seek legal guidance where you need it. So there's going to be some areas where you may need some help. And it's good to sort of be able to like get specific around what it is that you're seeing or where you have a question and where you need help sort of creating a case for your compliance.
Mark, can I jump in on one thing?
Yes.
There was a question about, well, what are the states doing? So NEBP, I think, has two accreditation programs. One is for drug distributors. It's called DDA, Drug Distributor Accreditation. I know from some clients, they're starting to see when they're having to redo the accreditation or do it for the first time, NEBP is looking at DSCSA requirements for the drug distributor on their accreditation inspection checklist. The corollary for the pharmacy side is called NEBP BPP, Verified Pharmacy Program. In essence, NEBP's inspection for pharmacies. I can't say for certain has DSCSA issues been coming up on those on the dispenser level yet, but given that I know it's already on the distributor, I suspect it's going to be more and more making its way down to the dispenser level. Just want to throw those two out there, that those are two accreditation programs from NEBP that you need an inspection to get the accreditation, and they're tying in the DSCSA requirements.
Great. Yeah, thanks for throwing that in, Jonathan. And then I guess just to kind of echo what you saw on the FDA side, So one of the things that we do with clients, and similar to what Jonathan said, is we can perform assessments for clients, and we wanted to just kind of share some of the summary things that we're seeing across all clients. And it's really kind of a similar trend. We're seeing when we do these assessments, and they can be done different ways. You can do them obviously internal. We can help you with checklists if you need that. They can be done with an independent party. The important thing is that who's ever doing it, you want to make sure that they understand DSCSA, not only the law and the guidances, but also like what is the industry doing? Because that tends to be how you really are able to show that you're complying is, hey, I'm doing it this way, and this is the way we're seeing as a best practice out in the industry. Because there unfortunately are some areas of DSCSA that are not overly specific. And it really comes down to how are you ensuring that you're covering the requirement. But similar kind of thing in terms of identification and suspect products, transaction data. Are you keeping the right records when you're receiving or sending ownership? ATP checks. This has been an area that I think has been confusing because, you know, there's some things in the law, there's some things in the guidance, there's a blueprint out there. And really it comes down to how are you defending, how you're complying with the law. So that's, for example, on the manufacturer side, if I'm working with suppliers, or rather if I'm a distributor working with manufacturers, how am I checking to make sure that they actually are manufacturers or repackagers? And do I have a documented process where I'm showing how I'm doing that? And similar things for distributors and dispensers. You should be checking the ATP status, especially for DSCSA transactions, but also whenever you're just moving product. So when you're selling or buying product, you should be checking their status. And obviously that goes back to, in most cases, the licensure. So, you know, what state are they licensed in and what are the policies and procedures in that state? But ATP check is one I think that's been confusing for a lot of people.
Mark, can you elaborate a bit more on what, for those perhaps in the webinar that are not that familiar with the ATP concept?
Right. So it's authorized trading partner. So in the law, basically, there are certain incidences where I need to respond to anybody that is an authorized trading partner. So for example, a manufacturer has to respond if they receive a verification request from an authorized trading partner, even if it is an indirect customer, for example. If they're authorized to have the product, then you have to respond to them, be able to respond to them. So the question is like, how do I tell if they're authorized, right? So at the end of the day, it's what is your process and procedures to do that? And it's important to note that like DSCSA ATP checks probably are different at a different level than like licensure checks. So they tend to be higher level. It generally gets interpreted to, does this entity have the right to be doing transactions? So for example, if I have 4 pharmacies and, you know, 3 of my pharmacies are in good standing, one has had a license revoked, I still have ATP status because I still have authorization to be holding product. But when you're selling product, it's different. You have to be able to, obviously, when you're selling to it, that's going to be more, does that specific location have a license that's valid? So it's important to understand that there's a different concept there. But at the end of the day, it's, do I have a policy and a procedure to show how I'm doing those checks and documenting so that when the FDA asks you to show it, or any regulator, that you're able to do that. Similar thing with record retention and training. I think Jonathan kind of mentioned that's definitely a big one is, you know, a lot of times clients will have procedures that they've either developed or they may have gotten templates from either solution providers, service providers, those kind of things. You really have to own it. I know the FDA is learning how to kind of watch for those things. They want to make sure that you are really training your employees and that they understand it, and that you're documenting that you're training them, and that you have records of that. So that is an important clarification. And then I guess last thing at the bottom, as we do assessments, there's a lot of areas where I'd say kind of best practices are starting to develop. That doesn't mean it's required by law, but it means it puts you in a better place in terms of being able to demonstrate that you're compliant. So we always recommend clients think about like what's best in class. So at least if you are not at that level, you're at least able to understand that you're not at that level and why. So it's really trying to be more preventive than even just minimal compliance, I guess. And I would also say when assessments are done, something we do and what we recommend you do is classify those findings that you have. So, if you do a mock inspection, for example, as you're developing a checklist or using a checklist, and you're saying, okay, this area we have a deficiency, be able to classify like how impactful is that? Is it something that's core to DSCSA and it's critical and it's very likely to get called out in a 483 or cited? Or is it something that's more open to interpretation and it's a best practice to do it this way because that's kind of what the industry is gravitating towards. So we've definitely leveraged that sort of leveling and also like best practice, which would kind of be the lowest level of I guess of required. So it's not required, but it's something to do as a best practice. And then just to show a little bit of a breakdown, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we do find differences by sector. So as we do this with manufacturers, distributors, dispensers, and 3PLs, we definitely see, number one, there's different requirements that apply. So typically, and there are different levels every requirement. So some requirements, with manufacturers, there's some pretty hard ones, especially with labeling and generating the data. When you go to distributors, they have more requirements because you think about it, you're receiving product, you're sending product. There's a lot more data movement and a lot more kind of interactions that are happening. So there's more requirements that are kind of related in total. 3PLs is an interesting one, and I think I saw a question like this. What we always kind of advise is make sure either if you are a 3PL or you are somebody using a 3PL or contracted agent or manufacturer, it's all about the agreements. So what we usually advise is start by saying, I, as an organization that is the holder of, authorization for this product, or as the licensed entity, I'm responsible to cover all aspects of DSCSA. If there are certain aspects that I'm allowing and asking my 3PL to do, you want to make sure that those are in agreements. So you want to make sure, in your 3PL agreements or quality agreements that they're doing, obviously you want to have the general call outs that they must follow the law, but you also want to get specific about like verification and tracing and all these different situations, who's handling what, and are they acknowledging that they're going to handle it? Because the last thing you want, and this happens from time to time, is for an inspector to come in and ask you a question and you say, oh, talk to my 3PL, and your 3PL to say, I don't know what you're talking about, or that's not my responsibility. You want to have those conversations before so that you're clear before that situation happens. So agreements, business agreements are key there. And that doesn't have to be in a formal contract. I think the FDA basically just has a business agreement. So it could be, I've seen clients do it in just just an email where they're documenting who's doing what, but you just want to make sure it's clear.
Yeah, I'll just add, so 3PLs, they don't take ownership of the product.
Right.
They take possession, but they never take the title. They just transport the product.
No, that's good call out, Jonathan. Yeah, that's definitely key to the 3PL role. It gets interesting with title model. If you're a manufacturer using a distributor and you have a title model agreement with them, they're effectively becoming a distributor in that scenario. So if they're taking title of the product and taking ownership from a DSCSA perspective, they are now a distributor because they've taken ownership. In general, there may be scenarios where something different applies, but in general, that's the way you want to treat that. And similar on, I guess, lastly, on the dispenser side, we see a slightly lower number of requirements because they're more receiving the product and doing things to make sure it stays safe. But in all these scenarios, I know we haven't had an assessment yet where we haven't found things. So there's always things to be found in terms of like, especially things like process connection points. So do my procedures, are they intuitive for a user or an associate to say, hey, if I'm doing a put away on a product and I have a suspect, something that looks suspicious, is there a link to help me understand how to get over to the procedures that are for handling suspect products. Those kind of things are usually areas where we find improvements needed, is just making sure that the communication flow and the ownership flow is clear. And then just a couple summary things, I guess. Following up on findings. So training and documentation, those regular effectiveness checks that I talked about. So once you've established, here's what we're going to check, keep that checklist. That checklist should then be updated, or you should have, a service partner that keeps an updated checklist that will come back in later and say, okay, I'm going to ask you now about the updated requirements. And it really just kind of pressure tests your organization as you go. And you want to make sure that things are clear. So always think of things in the end about like, hey, I'm an inspector walking into the facility. When I talk to somebody or ask somebody or I see something, what am I going to interpret? What am I going to see? I hear from a lot of inspectors, they'll always kind of say that they can usually tell how an inspection is going to go the minute they walk into a facility, because they'll look around and they'll see, do things like they're in control? Are things organized, or do people look like they're following processes? So just sort of setting that tone. I love one example we had a client that even had a parking space out front for state and federal auditors. Like when they pull up, they have a spot to go, so they didn't have to look for a spot. It was like you got the feeling of they know what they're doing and they're ready to show that they are following the law. And having that war room process that Jonathan talked about is also really key, because there's going to be a lot of scrambling when auditors show up. You want to try to keep that behind the scenes as much as you can, and just keep the inspector clear on what questions you're answering. So you want to be able to give firm answers. And if you need somebody to go check something, say, let me go ask the team to go look that stuff up for you real quick. And then the template thing is another big thing, avoiding templates. So we've seen it cited a few times already in the DSCSA stuff that the FDA has said there's appearance of using a cut and paste or a template procedure that wasn't understood by the user. So that's definitely something to watch out for. Is you want to make sure whatever you're using, even if you're starting with a template, that you build it into your processes so that it looks like it actually belongs there. And then I guess finally, in terms of things that you can do, the big thing is owning your compliance. So, don't assume anything. Like, don't assume your partner's going to do things or own things. Like, have those conversations before, like we talked about. Talk to your peers. DSCSA, I'd say the number one lesson that I think I hear over and over is like the value of talking to people at other organizations. The good thing is, and you can ask your legal group about it, is this is all about patient safety. So you don't have the kind of concerns that you have with antitrust and things like that. And in fact, the FDA like encourages, you to work with your peers, because it's all about how do we all kind of normalize things as an industry for keeping things safe, and leverage specialists where it's needed. So we've had a lot of situations where we come in and find clients had somebody that said they've read DSCSA, and you find out they really just started reading it and they didn't understand. There's a lot of history, industry groups, discussions, and normalization that has happened that you really want to get somebody that is experienced or becomes experienced. And those assessments are useful at any point. I guess that's the final point. So we typically, as a consulting company, we always do assessments at starts of projects when they're trying to gather requirements and things. But in this situation, you can do it at any point. It's good, right before you go live, after you go live, in a year. It's always good because you'll get a snapshot of what an audit might look like before you're actually in the audit. I guess I'll pass it back over to you, Pablo, for any questions.
Well, we have a bunch of questions. Okay, yeah, so does FDA considers all the DSCSA transactions data to be GMP?
Yeah, that's a very loaded question. I would say start with your QA people and validation. In general, if it has something to do with the labeling of the product or the data that you're storing and sharing, it's going to be GMP. I will typically say think of serial number in a similar way that you think of lot number. So in most cases, lot number is always GMP. Serial number is very similar. The situations where it might not be, or it might be out beyond your GMP, is going to be more about downstream. So when you have partners doing things, and that's going to depend on the situation. So if somebody calls you and has an open case that's been, distributed a few times before they got it, then it's probably beyond your control. But if it's a sealed case, and it still looks like it has evidence that it's remained sealed since you shipped it, then it may be within GMP. So definitely talk to your quality people and get them involved. That's really the crux of it.
I would add to that, Mark, as well, that make sure that you document your decisions in your procedures, right? That's showing evidence for the FDA is critical, right? Evidence of your position. So whatever you decide, because we have seen companies going in different directions when it comes to treating GMP or not, but make sure that you document. Okay, next.
So actually, let me jump. I see the question, and I can answer this one quickly.
Yeah.
How can we find FDA 43s that are specific to DSCSA? So FDA makes a subset of 43s available on its website. And typically, my understanding from what I hear is there needs to be at least 3 FOIA requests made to the agency. And then once they have those 3 FOIA requests, they will then post that 43 on their website. So to answer your question, how can you find 43s that have DSCSA? One, see if it's publicly posted on FDA's website. If not, submit a FOIA request to the agency to request 43s that have DSCSA findings. I do know one of the tabs on the FDA website, you can open up a number of Excel charts and it'll show, I think the most recent one was last year, all the various observations, and I think 2024 showed, was it 4 or 5 DSCSA observations. It didn't say in detail what they were, but it just said for DSCSA, there were a total of 4. But I know Pablo or Mark, anything to add on that front?
No, I think that's good. Yeah, I'd also say talk to your industry groups. I know some of the industry groups have done FOIA requests and share that with their members and things like that. So it's also another reason to be in industry groups, because a lot of times that's talked about in industry groups like as well.
Mark, there are 2 questions about if we are going to provide any templates or samples we can utilize as guides.
I guess it depends on which templates you're talking about. SOPs, we generally don't. We've found that it is better to start with the client's SOPs and help them build on from there. But I know there are some groups out there that are floating templates around for SOPs. I think the other one would be checklists, I guess. Inspection checklists that we treat as a product. So we do offer to sell our version of it. But I know that generally is not something that I see out in the industry as a template that's widely shared, I guess.
Cool. I guess on the same vein, there is a comment from Michelle here around the level of detail, how much in the weeds with the SOP, providing too much information but being clear, and then in the weeds with the work instruction for the employees with lots of examples. I'm finding there are a lot of company acronyms in the SOP, and I'm leaning towards taking all of these out and staying high level and staying with the overall process.
That's the art and the science of SOPs and procedures and work instructions. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I generally try to stay higher level but you want to make sure it's still effective though, obviously, like that that the person that's reading it's understanding what they're doing. And then work instructions usually, well, that's where we'll try to get into like specific systems and specific words that are to the organization. A lot of times that'll be things like system screens and things like that, that can change more frequently. So those are usually better, but you want to make sure that the compliance aspects are clear in the SOPs. So that's, I guess, the sort of, the science of it is you want to make sure, each requirement, like, the ability to do a verification request. You want to make sure there's at least enough in the SOP for when the auditor comes in and reads it, they see that, oh, okay, you have a process you're following to initiate that. And then the actual steps to do it are over there in the work instructions, but at least you understand that you have it and here's generally the steps that they follow.
I would add to that also is that you have to keep consistency with your overall PQS system, right? I mean, I'm assuming you already have like a quality system where you have a hierarchy of documents, right? So you should follow overall kind of like those guidelines, right? In terms of level of detail, right? I mean, treat DSCSA as a new regulatory requirement as you have to comply as any other, right? Like pharmacovigilance, you name it. Next question, there is a question here for, I guess, both of you. Is the legal receipt of pharmaceuticals, for example, antibiotics, from a distributor sufficient to qualify our business as a trading partner, and therefore subject to DSCSA product tracking requirements? What if these pharmaceuticals are used in preparation of other products, tissue grafts, which in and of themselves are not classified as products as defined in Section 582 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act?
Mark, I can jump in on this one, and I see
Yeah,
there's
go
a
ahead.
question later on about how do you extend DSA from manufacturers to specialty pharmacies? I can kind of group some of these together. So DSCSA explains that each manufacturer, repackager, distributor, dispenser has to comply with the requirements of DSCSA in connection with a transaction, defined term, involving a product, defined term. So if you're involved in a transaction that's not a product, easy example, compounded drugs, DSCSA doesn't apply. Same vein, if it's not a transaction, even though it might be a product, it wouldn't apply either. So to answer the question, the transfer, sale of the product from one entity to another doesn't make that other entity a trading partner. That other entity should already be a, quote, authorized, licensed, entity or trading partner who can receive that product. So it goes from distributor to a pharmacy. It's an authorized pharmacy if it's licensed to receive the product. If it's not a pharmacy or a pharmacy not licensed in that state, then it shouldn't be receiving the product and it's not, quote, an authorized trading partner. As to the manufacturer to a specialty pharmacy, I think you're getting at maybe like limited distribution drugs or directly from the manufacturer to the specialty pharmacy. In essence, DSCSA would still apply because there's still the transaction, the sale, the title of the product transferring from the manufacturer to the pharmacy. And I'm assuming the product is a finished pharmaceutical product.
I agree. I mean, the DSCSA doesn't prescribe a distribution model, right? You might have different distribution models, but this goes back to the comment that Mark made earlier around define what you are within the law in terms of trading partner. Like, what are you? Are you a pharmacy? If you're a specialty pharmacy, are you a dispenser? Okay, these are your requirements as a dispenser, right? Irrespective of how the distribution of that particular product may look like.
Yeah, and definitely exemptions and exceptions and those kind of things are definitely worth looking into because depending on the situation, if it's a clinician, there may be some exemption there. If it's a not-for-profit, there might be some exemptions. The specifics definitely are important in terms of like where might there be an area where DSCSA might not apply.
It looks like we don't have any more questions. We have 5 more minutes left. I guess perhaps 2 comments, like some departing words from Mark and Jonathan from you, in terms of like what if there is one takeaway that you can leave the audience with, what that would be. And then in terms of next steps, you guys are gonna receive the recording and an email with the recording and the slides. So feel free to dig in, and obviously feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or you want to discuss more around some of the comments we made today around the assessments.
Okay, go ahead, Jonathan. You have a thought?
Oh, so a final thought, I think for me, I feel like DSCSA has been out there for a while. Everyone knows it's coming or is in effect. So I think the inspectors want and expect that training partners are ready to comply. And, the expectation is that they have the right policies, SOPs, processes in place to be compliant. So, yeah.
That's good. Yeah, I think I'd add to that. I think, the aspect of prevention, how important it is. Like, it is a lot easier to do this on the front end, even though I know it's challenging when you're going live with the DSCSA and you're trying to make sure everybody's ready and all that. It's a lot easier to make sure that you're prepared rather than trying to deal with the 483. And, because that, like Jonathan described, it's a whole raised level where I've got my executives involved, legal involved, quality involved. Things are a lot harder and they take more time. So the more you can do to kind of help prevent and be proactive, it's worth its weight in gold, I think.
Thank you both. Very good, both. Thank you everyone for attending. Looking forward to hearing from all of you. And thanks for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.